Welcome to another episode of the Teaching Canada's History podcast. I'm your host, Brooke Campbell, and today we are speaking with the finalists of the 2024 Governor-General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching. Created in 1996, the award recognizes innovative and impactful approaches to teaching Canadian history. For more information, visit canadashistory.ca/teaching award. Today I'm chatting with Michele Schwab, a high school teacher in Balcarres, Saskatchewan. Thank you for joining me today, Michele.
Thanks for having me.
Can you share more about the project that you have done in your classroom and, maybe explain what your students have been working on?
My students, through a credit course in practical and applied arts, completed a 70-plus page magazine that shared stories, opinions, and ideas centered around interviewing Indigenous Kitayak and getting their perspectives on current issues facing Aboriginal people in today's society.
Thanks. And what are some of the main steps that your students had to go through then to accomplish, writing this magazine?
The first thing that we had to do was approach this from an Indigenous perspective, which always involves getting input from a Kitayak. In our case, it was Elder Alma who comes to our school. My students and I sat down with her to seek her guidance on the appropriate way to address these issues, as they are very sensitive issues such as residential schools, treaties, missing and murdered Indigenous women. And she provided the guidance we needed to start the project. So the first thing that my students did was become more educated on the topics themselves. They did internet research. They spoke to people in their homes. We did a carousel learning activity and a jigsaw learning activity so that they could share their knowledge with their classmates. Then we sat down with Elder Alma again, and she was very appreciative of the students' knowledge, appreciative of their hard work. The next stage was to schedule and meet with the knowledge carriers in our community. So students chose the knowledge carriers. I teach in a community that borders 4 First Nations, Star Blanket First Nation, Okanese First Nation, Little Black Bear First Nation, and Pepicasis First Nation. And I have students from all of those nations in my class. So the students chose people that were of importance to them. Some were family, some were close friends, chiefs, people that are involved in all aspects of Indigenous knowledge and worldviews. From there, we met with our interviewees. Some of our students did that at home on their own time. They went out to the community to meet with their people. We did have some people come into the school, and then we captured and recorded all of their interviews, which we turned into a podcast. From that point, we re-listened to the interviews, and students chose thinking points from the interviews. So it could have been a quote, it could have been something that they learned, it could have just been something that intrigued them. And we then compiled their knowledge, whether it was in a writing piece that expressed the student's opinion on what they had learned in regards to the topic, or it captured the knowledge gained from the interviewee. And also we used what we learned to create art for the magazine, and we also created art pieces that showcased the issues from a visual perspective in a show that was separate from the magazine.
There's so many layers to this work. It's really beautifully interwoven. Can you share how your students were able to engage with history and with historical thinking throughout this work?
This entire project was based on inquiry learning and based on oral histories. I feel that when looking at Indigenous history, you can gain a baseline from internet research, reading, we were able to access historical documents through our interviewees. But really, when you look at appropriately learning Indigenous content, it is through the oral tradition and through language and speaking with the people firsthand. So I feel that for my students, they developed a knowledge of history straight from people who have lived it. Residential school survivors, people that have lost children to the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis. One of our chiefs is an expert on the treaties and has done amazing work around that. And from this knowledge, my pride for my students comes from the fact that my students know now that they are now the carriers forward of that knowledge, of that historical knowledge, and that in their life, they have a responsibility now to be the new knowledge carriers. It was really impressed upon them from the Kitayak and other knowledge carriers that what are you going to do with what you've learned? How are you going to use that now? So one of my grade 12 students is going into education, and she made a very strong connection to the fact that she now has a responsibility to teach the children she will be teaching about these things. So it was a multi-layered project, but I think when you look at the historical significance of it is that I feel my students become the next line of knowledge carriers. Even though they are only in high school, they definitely understood the responsibility that was provided to them and for them now to continue.
Yeah, you've really emphasized the importance of community in your work, and in your classroom at large. Can you tell us more about the resources, and that includes the people that you like to use and to reach out to help support this work?
Yeah, I'm really lucky in the community that I teach in, that people are always willing to work and share with the youth. I worked with a Dakota artist, Holly Zichipi. Her and I have done several projects together, and she's very comfortable in our building. Although most of my students are like of Cree or Soto descent, she brings an artistic component and a cultural arts component that's not just like tokenism, sort of like arts and crafts. It's actually based very firmly in, again, like culture and traditions, and learning techniques. Like they dyed porcupine quills, they learned the beading techniques. We encased all of our art pieces in red willow. And then another mentor that I worked with was Brad Belgard, and he's a journalist and a musician. And he helped on the podcast and interviewing side as a support to me. And that was a really important connection for my students because he's from Little Black Bear. So my students were able to see a successful Indigenous person in a role that came to help them, but also someone who originated from their community. It was really enlightening for a couple of my students when they were able to go into the homes of some of the knowledge carriers, and they were shown historical documents, they were shown photos, they were shown all kinds of things that I don't think without those connections of community we would not have had access to.
I feel like you've already shared so many anecdotes that speak to the impact of this work, but maybe I'll ask if you can then, if you take a step back and you look at it as a whole, how would you summarize that impact that it's had on your students and and on the community, and maybe what are some of the outcomes that you've seen?
One of my grade 12 students, his dad took the opportunity to get a sneak peek of the magazine. And it was when we were actually doing an interview in our culture room in our building. And when he came back, he impressed upon me that this student had interviewed his mushum. And he said that I know based on the article that my son wrote that my teachings and his Musham's teachings have impacted him. And he was so proud of his student and so proud that his son, pardon me, that there were opportunities like that to learn like that. I think for my students, the opportunity to have real life experiences and real life learning, these are the things that will stick with them. These are the things that they're going to take further when they leave the building. And history comes alive when someone shares it with you from a firsthand perspective. And a lot of our interviewees were very candid with their experiences. Our residential school survivors that we spoke to, there's no way that reading from a book would have been as impactful as hearing them share what happened to them when they were in residential school, or the File Hills Colony experiment, which is another example of something in history that is probably not very well known. And actually having someone who is the keeper of all of that information be able to share that and now know that another generation is going to have all of that information to pass on. It's truth. It's sharing of truth and being able to take that truth and then put it into your own heart and decide, now what are you going to do with it? What is your responsibility? How are you going to take that further so that all of these stories and all of this knowledge doesn't go away as our elders and knowledge carriers pass on?
Those are some really powerful and moving
Thank you so
examples
much for having.
of the work that's been done and the impact of this project. Thank you so much, Michele, for sharing this all with me today and for sharing more about what's going on in your classroom.
Thank you so much for having me and showcasing our school.